Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about sex, gender, and sexuality. To really understand these concepts, we're going to have to delve into the definitions. So, whenever we're talking about sex, we're going to be talking about biological sex based upon chromosomes, gonads, and genitalia. When we're talking about gender, we're going to be talking about the perception of what sex you think you are, which is also associated with your gender identity. And then when we talk about sexual orientation, we're going to be talking about which sex or sexes you are attracted to. So, first, when we start talking about sex, from a psychological perspective and a biological perspective, we have to be talking about this concept of biological determinism. Again, how much of your genetics and your brain structure is associated with your behavior as either male, female, or an identity in between the range of male and female? So again, whenever you're thinking about your personality, you need to be considering how are your genetics, your genetic personality, your genetic self, how is that associated with your behavior? So when it comes to sex, we're going to be asking questions like, is there a difference between male, female, and intersex? And if there is a difference physically, biologically, how much is that associated with our behavior? From a psychological perspective, we would focus a little bit more on cognitions, and biology and genetics. And then from a sociological perspective, we're really going to be looking at things like how does your sex that you identify with, your gender, your sexual orientation, how is that associated with your access, your ability to rise up the social class ladder, and your life chances? We're also going to be asking questions such as how does our gender develop? How does our gender identity develop? From a psychological perspective, again, you might be looking at cognitions and brain structure and genetics. And then from a sociological perspective, we'll be looking at the socialization process. How do we learn? How do we internalize what it means to be male or female? But again, we have to ask the question, how much of our behavior is associated with our biology? Because there is an association between some factors. However, from a psychological perspective, the main argument is that despite differences between males, females, and intersex, the effect on behavior is very minimal. Therefore, most of the behavioral differences between males and females and intersex are associated with the social context. So again, it's a really interesting question. One, are males and females and intersex different? Two, if so, how biologically are they different? And this you can look at hormone levels. Again, you can look at genitalia and gonads and how does that influencing you? Um, but again, we need to be asking the question of how much does our sex, how much does our gender influence our behavior? And then how does the social context then influence our cognitions? Hence, in order to really understand sex, gender, and sexuality, you have to take a biopsychosocial approach because we can't understand males and females, differences between men and women, if we don't understand the body and the structure of the brain. We can't understand differences and similarities if we don't understand cognition, psychological factors. And we can't understand differences if we don't understand the influence of the social context, meaning the socialization factors. But whenever we're talking sex, again, that is specifically limited to the biological category, gonads, genitalia, and chromosomes. Gender, by contrast with sex, has nothing to do with your actual biology. It has everything to do with cognition, perceptions. So, gender is defined simply as the perception of what sex you think you are. Now, some really challenging questions. One, how many sexes are there? And the answer is a minimum of three. Okay? Because there's male, female, and then 2 out of every 100 are born with ambiguous chromosomes and genitalia, for example. So even a doctor cannot tell whether a person is male or female. Hence, humans in our sex, our biological sex, comes in a range, in a spectrum. Gender is the same exact way. The idea of gender is it's a perception of what sex you are, but the categories are completely infinite. So, again, typically, historically, we always had just two sexes, male and female. Over time, we recognize intersex. There's now a third sex. Initially, we had two genders, male and female. But now, over time, as you guys can see, the gender categories are exponentially growing, meaning there are a minimum of 70 recognized genders, compounded with all the other different genders that people might think they are. So this is the idea that gender is socially constructed. These categories that we use to identify who we are and what groups we belong to are social constructs. It's us who decides what is difference, the meanings that are attached to the difference, and then the categorical labels that we will attach to these differences. Okay, so gender is socially constructed, meaning that it's a human construction. We're the ones who make the categories, we're the ones who decide the criteria for the categories. And again, when it comes to gender, the number of genders is infinite. Okay? However, when it comes to our gender identity, what is very important is this gender socialization process, the way that agents of socialization in society, such as your family and your peers, and the media, and religion, and the education system, how do they structure your gender identity? How is your biological sex associated with how people socialized you? If you identify as a female because you have the biological attributes of a female, were you raised as a female? Were you socialized to behave as a female, to follow the rules and expectations attached to these gender categories? And this again points to the idea that the differences between men and women, albeit there are some biological differences, the main differences come from the gender socialization process. What type of clothes and colors do your parents dress you in when you were young, or whoever raised you? What kind of toys were you given? How were you expected to behave? And so the idea is over time, throughout development, we are told and discover what sex we are. Okay? Then, once we learn what sex we are, we begin to model and imitate that behavior of the sex, the group that we identify with. Hence, the idea that we talked about earlier is the groups that you identify with are incredibly important, not only for your status, your ability to rise up the social class ladder, and life chances, but also because it influences your behavior. Therefore, if you're socialized as a girl, people tend to act like a girl. If you're socialized as a boy, people tend to act like a boy. But what acting like a boy means is socially constructed. It's society that dictates that boys are supposed to be aggressive and not emotional, and girls are supposed to be emotional and non aggressive. Both men and women have testosterone. Both men and women are aggressive. Both men and women are nurturing. However, you got to ask how much of that's biological and how much of that's socialized. Are women nurturing more than men because of the socialization process? And you could argue it's also a biological process and that girls have babies and they have to be nurturing. But boys also have responses to having babies. When boys have babies, our testosterone levels reduce and we become more passive in general. So again, the male, female, biological differences, we all have a lot of range of behaviors that are capable, and men, just the same as women, are capable of the same number of behaviors. You can say that men are slightly more aggressive because of testosterone and things like that, but again, how violence and aggression is accepted in the social context and how people are socialized regarding, what is appropriate behavior and what isn't is also highly associated with whether somebody is aggressive. Okay? So your gender identity is this biopsychosocial process. It's a blend between how do you feel? Do you feel masculine? Do you feel feminine? Do you feel in somewhere along that continuum spectrum between masculine and feminine? Are you one that doesn't identify with the categories at all? Just get rid of the categories and free yourself to be full of experience. How much of your identity is associated with your cognitions and the way you think? And then how much of your gender identity has been socialized by other people? How much of your sense of self has developed through social interaction and learning about how you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to behave? Okay? So, when it comes to gender roles, this idea of the division of labor into man and woman, okay, the initial division of labor, you have these gender roles that range from traditional to egalitarian. Historically, the traditional gender roles were women as homemaker, man as breadwinner. In the United States, in modern times, you've seen a huge shift toward much more egalitarian in general when it comes to gender roles because of all the women's rights movements and the feminist rights movements and the reduction of sexism and the changing of people's attitudes toward females. All of these factor in people becoming more positive toward women's rights, women becoming CEOs and doctors and lawyers historically when they were excluded. So when it comes to gender roles, we adopt the roles of the that are attached to our gender. Because again, with each gender, there's a set of social expectations, rules, norms that we tend to adopt. Therefore, if we're adopting traditional roles, men are adopting the role of being the provider and going out working and not really being there as much to take care of the kids. And women will be taking on the roles of the homemaker and cooking and cleaning and things along those lines. And then in modern times and egalitarian times when both men and women are working, how is that influencing gender roles? Is that creating gender role conflict? Because you have women who are working all the time and are home with their babies that they feel like they should be, and the men are home with the babies that they feel like they should be working. So again, once you discover what sex you are, then you learn the expectations, the rules, the behaviors that are attached to that sex, and then you begin to model and adopt that sex. Then your gender identity starts to develop as male, female, or another category. Okay? Gender roles are attached to the sex that you decide to identify with. Okay, and so once you identify as a male and you are socialized to be a male, so comes with the socialization process, you being socialized to fulfill the social role of male. But again, what is masculine and what is feminine are also socially constructed. It's us who created the categories of masculinity and femininity. It's us who dictates what's acceptable behavior for males, females, and others. Okay, so these are just things you should be thinking about. Sexism is the belief that one sex is superior to another. Historically, non males were stuck in the lower classes, not granted access to participate in society, not allowed to get social mobility and rise up the social class ladders, not allowed to take elite social positions. Again, as we're exploring these forms of social stratification like race, sex and gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, country of origin. All these factors are associated with where you're located in the social class system. Therefore, women, along with all other minorities, were stuck in the lower classes because of European domination of the United States, for example. So, England historically owned the United States. Light-skinned males from England owned the United States, who then oppressed women. After the Revolutionary War, light-skinned males born in the United States took over the United States and got power. They also denied access to women, did not write them in the Constitution, did not give them power. Women were not allowed to vote until 100 years ago. We're not really allowed to become doctors or lawyers until around the 1960s. And still, you're still seeing the effects of sexism when it comes to pay rates, hiring practices, and then if we look at it from sexism on a global standard, again, women are more likely to be property than own property globally. The only reason that there's women in the classroom is because one, we're in the United States. In a lot of other countries, you're not going to find women in the classroom because sexism is so strong and patriarchy is so strong that women are completely denied access. So again, sexism is based upon these systems of privilege, power, male power, and oppression. The dominant group, men, subjugating women into the lower classes. The origin of gender inequality, of sexism, comes from the idea of thinking that men and women are different, and then the meanings we attach to those differences. So again, it's the meanings attached to what it means to be male, meanings attached to what it means to be female, and the ideologies about men and women. That is the origin of sexism, prejudice, discrimination, male privilege, male power, and oppression of women. So again, gender inequality is due to the dividing into groups, social stratification into males and females, and then ranking one as superior and another as inferior. Sexual orientation is another form of stratification. Historically, in the United States, if you said, I am gay in a classroom in 1972, they would have diagnosed you with a psychological disorder and put you in an institution. Again, attitudes towards sexuality are social constructions. It is society, individuals in society, coming up with these ideas about what is normal and what is not normal, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and then imposing social control upon norm violations. So when it comes to sexual orientation, people that identified as non-heterosexual for the last couple hundred years have been identified as abnormal, given a psychological disorder, and institutionalized. This is completely unacceptable because being gay is part of our genetics, it's part of being human, and it doesn't cause anybody harm. The only harm that is caused by someone saying, I am gay, is the harm imposed upon the person that identifies as gay by straight people, stigmatizing them for identifying as gay. Sexuality exists along a continuum. Humans are capable of an incredible amount of sexual acts, some that we can label deviant and should label deviant, and others that we should label perfectly normal. For example, humans will have sex with animals. Should we label that deviant to protect the animals? Humans will rape children. Pedophilia exists. Should we have rules against that? Yes, to protect the children. Should we have rules about having sex with minors? Yes, to protect the children. Those make sense. Those are logical rules. Should we have rules about a woman having a baby without being married? Because historically, if you were a girl and a single mom and it was the 1950s, you would have been ostracized from society. Should it be abnormal should we label somebody as gay, as abnormal, just because of social norms and attitudes toward homosexuality? Or should we see through it that that doesn't cause harm and that's totally part of being human? Because again, having sex with animals, having sex with children, having heterosexual sex, having monogamous relationships, having non-monogamous relationships, having one partner, having multiple partner, having homosexual relationships is all part of human genetics. Alexander the Great, our greatest conqueror, identified as homosexual. Again, so just depending on the culture you're in, dictates whether or not it's acceptable or not. Different aspects of sexuality. Okay? So when it comes to sexual orientation, we're talking about an attraction to a sex or multiple sexes. But some of our sexual orientation, some of our sexuality needs to be social controlled. We need laws. We need rules. Because again, 25% of women are raped. 1 in 4. So yes, we need rules against rape. Otherwise, humans will rape. But do we need rules against homosexuality, for example? No, because it doesn't hurt anybody. So again, our attitudes have completely shifted when it comes to homosexuality. We've accepted that sexuality exists upon a range between straight and gay, and it's arguable that anyone is truly straight or gay. Most likely everyone's kind of within that range between straight and gay. And again, that might be hard to hear at first. But when you start looking at the research, this is what the research suggests that sexuality exists along a continuum. And we measure people's sexuality somewhere in a range between straight and homosexual. So again, some of our sexuality needs socially control. We need norms. We need to label some things as norm violations just to protect people in society. But again, not all things that have historically been seen as deviant are actual norm violations. They're actually just perfectly normal. Being gay is normal. Being straight is normal. Okay? So again, the history of heterosexism and homophobia goes deep, and it goes deep into American culture, and it goes deep into English culture, and it goes deep globally across the world, okay? So, but now you're starting to see things change as we've become more educated, as we've opened up books, and we kind of realize how things actually work, okay? But arguably, as with all minorities, people of minority status, sexual orientations experience prejudice and discrimination. A woman is paid less than a man, and so is a man that identifies as gay. Okay, a man that identifies as gay is often paid 20% less because of hiring managers' prejudice and discrimination toward people that identify as gay. So again, we need to look at some of our norms and our rules because again, it was incredibly taboo for an African American to marry a white person. Just like it was incredibly taboo to say I am gay 50 years ago. But now in modern times, there are 10 million interracial marriages. In 1980, there were only 400,000. Things are changing. We are challenging the old traditional norms and asking really big questions like, is being gay normal? Yes, it's in your genes. Your genetics are absolutely associated with your attraction. Your body releases hormones when you're attracted to something. Can you control your endocrine system? No, your endocrine system is an automatic biological process. You have no control over your hormones. So applying the theories to gender and sexuality. So when you're asking when you're looking at functionalism and going to apply it, again, you're going to be asking, what's the purpose of the institution? What's the purpose of the rules? What's the purpose of gender roles, for example? How did gender roles structure our life? Did it take care of some basic survival needs, like the kids were taken care of, and the house was taken care of, and the hunting was taken care of by traditionally dividing into female roles and male roles, that which we label female and male? Or from a conflict perspective, does um, dividing into gender roles create conflict because then women who want to do a man's role, such as being historically like a historical man's role, like being a doctor, were blocked out. They weren't allowed to participate. A woman wanting to be a senator wasn't allowed to participate, even if they were perfectly competent. Therefore, half of the potential doctors that we could have had, because half of the population is female, were restricted from even trying. Therefore, even though traditional gender roles might have served a function, in modern times we're recognizing that to allow women to participate is not going to do anything but make things better. That's more potential Einsteins. So if we keep subjugating women into the lower classes, not allowing them to take elite social positions, how much conflict is that causing between men and women? And symbolic interactionism would say, guys, we're the ones who made up gender roles. We're the ones who make up words like masculinity and femininity, and we decide how a man is supposed to be. And then we teach our children that. That's girl stuff. Don't play with that. You're supposed to play with that because that's boy stuff. You can't wear pink. That's for girls. You have to wear blue. Well, why can't a boy wear pink without someone calling him gay? Why can't someone wear a tuxedo to prom without somebody calling him a lesbian? And again, these are the stereotypes. These words, the meaning that's produced through social interaction that's resulting in prejudicial and discriminatory ideologies that we need to deconstruct in order so people can recognize that being gay is perfectly normal. But again, your status within groups, your location within groups is associated with your status, your ability to rise up the social class ladder, get access, get opportunity. So again, people that identified as female, people that identified as transsexual, people that identified as homosexual, they experience stigmatization and prejudice and discrimination, which then affects their overall life chances. It increases the likelihood of them experiencing physical and psychological distress. It's associated with life expectancy. It's associated with health. So again, historically, light-skinned males of European descent were the only ones that were allowed to get the elite social positions. Now in modern times, this can be challenged by minority groups, and hopefully the idea about these groups being minorities will wither away too. That's just a future hope when prejudice and discrimination maybe disappears ultimately. The dark side of oppression is this: sex trafficking of illiterate women, for example. Why is it that illiteracy is the number one factor associated with sex trafficking? Because if you don't give somebody a book, you don't give them an education, you don't give them a job, they can't get wealth, they can't rise up the social class ladder. So number one way of keeping women down historically has been to make sure they can't read a book. But sex trafficking exists. Abuse against women and minorities exists, both physical and sexual. Again, a woman is more likely to be property than own property globally, which is it sounds kind of odd in these modern times in the United States, but even in the US 150 years ago, that's the way it was too. And again, why is there a woman in this classroom and not others across the globe? Why is it that in the United States we can have women in classes, but in other countries that's not the case? What's changed? What's different? What's going on? How do we maintain this? I have a daughter. Of course, I'm concerned for all of these factors. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please email. Have a great day.